Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588. The most powerful empire on Earth assembled the largest invasion fleet in human history, commanded unlimited wealth from American silver mines, and had God himself, or so they believed, guiding their cannons toward Protestant England. They lost to a nation with 40 warships, an empty treasury, and weather that didn't care about anyone's prayers. Spain controlled half of Europe, possessed professional armies that terrified the continent, and could field more soldiers than England had farmers. England had pirates pretending to be admirals, a queen most of Catholic Europe considered illegitimate, and a navy so small that merchants had to loan their ships just to make a defensive line. The Spanish spent 2 years preparing their armada with mathematical precision. The English spent 2 years panicking and hoping Francis Drake's reputation would somehow compensate for not having enough gunpowder. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about wars. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. You're English. You're 23 years old. You've never seen Spain, never questioned that Catholics worship wrong, never imagined your small island nation could stand against the force now gathering across the channel. You know Elizabeth is your queen, the way you know winter follows autumn. It's simply true, ordained, the natural order. Your father fought at sea once, came back with stories about Spanish treasure ships so heavy with silver they could barely sail. Those ships belonged to an empire that stretched from Peru to the Philippines, an empire that considered England a heretic stain to be scrubbed from existence. The smell reached London before the news did. Not cannon smoke, that came later. The smell of fear, actually, which smells like nothing at all but makes everything else sharper. Rotting fish at the docks became more pungent. Smoke from cooking fires seemed thicker. The leather of your boots felt heavier as you walked to the harbour where men were frantically loading supplies onto merchant vessels the Crown had commandeered. One rat scurried across your boot, fat and unconcerned, as if it knew it would outlive everyone currently preparing for war. Philip II of Spain sat in the Escorial Palace outside Madrid, surrounded by maps and reports, convinced he was doing God's work. His empire generated revenue that made other kings weep with envy. Mexican and Peruvian silver flooded Spanish coffers annually, enough to fund armies, fleets, and the Catholic reconquest of Protestant territories. He'd been patient with England for decades, watching Elizabeth support Dutch rebels, encourage pirates to raid his treasure ships, and execute his Catholic allies. Patience had expired. The Pope himself blessed this enterprise. Bishops called it a crusade. Philip called it inevitable. England's treasury contained approximately nothing. Elizabeth had been selling crown lands, borrowing from merchants, and delaying payments to sailors for years. Her annual revenue amounted to roughly what Spain collected in 3 months from American colonies alone. The Royal Navy officially possessed 34 warships, most needing repairs. Defending an entire coastline with 34 ships was like defending a castle with 34 bricks. Merchant vessels would supplement the fleet, of course, but merchants wanted their ships back in one piece, preferably filled with profitable cargo rather than cannonballs and corpses. The English had one advantage nobody fully understood yet. Their ships were different, longer, narrower, faster than the massive Spanish galleons. English shipwrights had been experimenting with designs that sacrificed cargo space for speed and maneuverability. Spanish galleons were floating fortresses designed for boarding actions, essentially medieval castles with sails. English race-built galleons were predators designed to circle and strike. Nobody knew if this tactical philosophy would work against a fleet 10 times larger. In Lisbon harbour, the Armada began gathering in late 1587. 130 ships, 30,000 men, 8,000 sailors, 19,000 soldiers, provisions for 6 months, 2,400 cannons. The scale was staggering. Ships arrived from Naples, from Sicily, from every corner of Spanish dominion. Supply officers filled warehouses with barrels of salted meat, dried fish, rice, wine, water, gunpowder, cannonballs, rope, timber, and bandages. The logistics of feeding 30,000 men at sea for months required careful calculation. Someone miscalculated. Nobody noticed until much later, when men were dying and the miscalculation mattered. The original commander was the Marquis of Santa Cruz, an experienced admiral who understood naval warfare. He died in February 1588, possibly from stress, definitely at the worst possible time. Philip needed a replacement immediately. The invasion couldn't wait. England was growing stronger, Dutch rebels were becoming bolder, and the Protestant heresy needed crushing before it spread further. Philip chose the Duke of Medina Sidonia, one of Spain's richest nobles. Medina Sidonia owned vast estates, understood administration, commanded respect among the aristocracy, and had absolutely no naval combat experience whatsoever. Medina Sidonia received Philip's appointment letter and wrote back immediately. The Duke begged to be excused. He got seasick easily. He knew nothing about naval tactics. He'd never commanded ships in battle. He didn't speak English and didn't understand English waters. The letter was desperate, almost pathetic. Philip ignored it completely. Medina Sidonia was noble, wealthy, and loyal, qualities Philip valued more than expertise. Besides, the plan was simple enough that competent subordinates could handle tactical details. Sail to the Netherlands, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's veteran army, transport 30,000 additional soldiers across the Channel, land them in England and march on London. Nothing could go wrong if everyone followed orders. Everything was already going wrong. The food started rotting in the barrels before the fleet even departed. Portuguese suppliers had provided shoddy containers, meat spoiled, water turned foul. Supply officers discovered the problem, reported it to Medina Sidonia, who reported it to Philip, who ordered them to just buy more supplies and depart as scheduled. Delays were unacceptable. God would provide. The Spanish court operated on faith and rigid planning in roughly equal measure, neither of which was particularly useful when your provisions were literally rotting. England watched the preparations with mounting terror. Spy networks sent regular reports about ship numbers, troop strength, and departure dates. Elizabeth's council met constantly, arguing about strategy, resources, and whether they should negotiate peace before the invasion crushed them. Some councillors suggested offering concessions to Spain, perhaps tolerate some Catholic worship in exchange for calling off the Armada. Elizabeth refused. She'd spent 30 years maintaining her throne against Catholic plots, foreign intimidation, and assassination attempts. She wasn't about to surrender her kingdom to avoid a fight she might lose anyway. The English coastal towns prepared for slaughter. Local militias drilled with outdated weapons. Farmers sharpened scythes and pitchforks because they had nothing else. England's professional army was tiny, perhaps 5,000 trained soldiers total. The Spanish would land with 30,000 veterans who'd fought in the Netherlands, men who knew how to form pike squares, coordinate artillery, and crush amateur resistance. English military theorists calculated that if the Spanish achieved a successful landing, London would fall within a week. After London fell, Protestant England would cease to exist. Elizabeth would be executed, probably publicly. Catholicism would be reimposed by force. Everyone who'd supported the Protestant settlement would face trials, confiscations, and possibly death. Francis Drake walked Plymouth's waterfront in April 1588, watching workers prepare ships for combat. Drake was technically a pirate whom Spain wanted hanged for raiding their colonial ports. He'd circumnavigated the globe, captured Spanish treasure ships, and emerged as England's most famous naval commander, despite having started his career raiding slave ships. He was ruthless, brilliant, arrogant, and possibly insane by conventional standards. He told anyone who'd listen that the Spanish could be beaten. Nobody quite believed him, but his confidence was infectious. England needed heroes, even questionable ones who'd made their fortunes stealing Spanish gold. Lord Howard of Effingham commanded the English fleet, a position he'd received through aristocratic connections rather than naval expertise. He was 60 years old, politically astute, personally brave, and smart enough to listen to Drake and other experienced captains. The English command structure was chaotic. Nobles who'd bought their positions worked alongside promoted commoners who actually understood sailing. Arguments erupted constantly about tactics, supplies, and who should command which squadron. The Spanish had a rigid hierarchy with clear chains of command. The English had creative chaos that somehow functioned despite itself. May 1588 arrived with still no armada. Spanish preparations were taking longer than Philip had calculated. Supply problems, weather delays, and organisational chaos kept pushing back the departure date. England used the time to gather more ships, stockpile ammunition, and fortify coastal defences. Beacon chains were established across the country. Hilltop fires that would spread warning of the invasion from coast to capital within hours. Every village assigned watchers, every port prepared to burn their own ships rather than let Spain capture them. The psychological warfare was almost worse than actual fighting would have been. Waiting, watching, knowing the largest invasion force in history was coming but not knowing exactly when. English sailors sat in Plymouth harbour for weeks, consuming precious supplies while waiting for an enemy that didn't arrive. Some ships had to return to port for repairs or resupply, weakening the defensive fleet at random intervals. The Spanish strategy of simply existing as a massive threat was working beautifully without them having to do anything. Philip issued final orders in late May. The Armada would sail to the Netherlands, link with Parma's army and invade. But there was a critical problem nobody had solved. Parma's forces were in Flemish ports blockaded by shallow draft Dutch rebel ships. The Spanish Armada consisted of deep water vessels that couldn't enter shallow coastal waters. Parma's invasion barges couldn't venture into deep water where English warships would destroy them. The two halves of Spain's plan couldn't actually connect without someone controlling the shallow coastal zone between them. Nobody in Madrid seemed to have noticed this detail. Or if they had, they assumed Parma would solve it somehow. Parma assumed the Armada would solve it. Both commanders waited for the other to resolve an impossible problem. The Armada finally departed Lisbon on May 28, 1588. 130 ships sailed in formation, an awe-inspiring sight that witnesses claimed stretched from horizon to horizon. Then storms hit. Atlantic weather hammered the fleet for days. Ships scattered. Some sustained damage. Medina Sidonia, already seasick and miserable, ordered the fleet to shelter in the Spanish port of Corunna for repairs. They'd been at sea less than a week. Repairs took another month. More food spoiled. More water containers leaked. More time passed while England prepared. July 12th. The Armada departed Spain again. This time they made it past the Bay of Biscay. The weather held. 130 ships sailed northeast toward the English Channel, in a formation that Medina Sidonia believed was invincible. The crescent shape put the strongest galleons on the flanks and protected supply ships in the centre. Breaking through would require punching through massive warships armed with hundreds of cannons. The formation looked unstoppable because it was designed to be unstoppable if your enemy fought the way Spain expected. July 19th, 1588, afternoon, English scouts spotted the Spanish fleet off the Lizard, Cornwall's southernmost point. Signal beacons ignited. Fire leaped from hilltop to hilltop, carrying news of the invasion across southern England at the speed of flame and watchful eyes. In Plymouth, Drake was supposedly playing bowls when the warning arrived. The story claims he insisted on finishing the game, declaring there was time to complete the match and beat the Spaniards too. The story is probably invented, but it captured something true. England's defenders were either supremely confident or fatally deluded, and nobody was quite sure which. The English fleet prepared to exit Plymouth Harbour. This was dangerous. The wind was blowing toward shore, making it difficult for sailing ships to leave port. Spanish galleons could bottle them up, trap them in harbour, and destroy them at anchor. English crews warped their ships out manually, attaching cables to anchors dropped ahead of the ship and physically pulling themselves forward against the wind. It took all night. Exhausting, desperate work. If the Spanish attacked during this process, the war would end before it properly began. But Medina Sidonia followed his orders. Don't engage, don't stop, reach the Netherlands. The Armada sailed past Plymouth without attacking the trapped English fleet. Spanish captains watched English ships struggling to escape the harbour and argued for immediate assault. Medina Sidonia refused. Philip's instructions were absolute. Proceed to rendezvous with Parma. Don't waste time with side battles. The logic was sound. Why fight the English fleet now when you could wait until after combining with Parma's army and overwhelming them with superior numbers? In retrospect, it was possibly the Armada's greatest mistake. Wars are won by seizing opportunities, not following plans. By dawn on July 20th, the English fleet was at sea behind the Armada. Drake commanded the Western Squadron. Howard led the centre. Lord Henry Seymour guarded the eastern approaches in case Spanish ships tried sneaking through the Strait of Dover. 34 Royal Navy warships plus about 60 armed merchant vessels faced 130 Spanish ships. The numbers were catastrophic. But the English had the wind gauge. They were upwind of the Spanish, which meant they could control engagement ranges. Spanish ships would have to sail against wind to close with them. That advantage would matter more than anyone expected. The hunt up the Channel was about to begin. Behind the fleets, beacon fires continued burning. In London, Elizabeth prepared to address her troops. In the Netherlands, Parma's army waited for ships that couldn't reach them. In Spain, Philip prayed for victory that God had apparently already decided against. The summer of 1588 had begun. Nothing would ever be quite the same after it ended. Medina Sidonia stood on the flagship San Martin's deck watching England's green coastline pass to starboard, fighting nausea that had nothing to do with the waves. The appointment letter from Philip sat in his cabin like a death sentence written on royal parchment. He'd tried everything short of faking his own death to escape this command. Philip had responded to each excuse with the same infuriating patience. God had chosen Medina Sidonia for this sacred task, and God's choices weren't subject to human preferences. The Duke understood land warfare reasonably well: logistics, supply chains, troop movements. Water was different. Ships moved in 3 dimensions, affected by wind, tide, and currents that changed hourly. His admirals tried explaining concepts like windward advantage and how to maintain formation when every vessel sailed at different speeds. Medina Sidonia listened carefully, understood perhaps half of what they said, and prayed his subordinates knew enough to compensate for his ignorance. Command by committee was terrible tactical doctrine, but it was all he had. Spanish captains commanding the Armada's various squadrons represented the empire's naval aristocracy. Men like Recalde, Oquendo, and de Leyva had decades of combat experience between them. They'd fought Ottomans in the Mediterranean, crushed rebellions in the Americas, and commanded fleets that ruled the seas through sheer intimidating presence. They respected Medina Sidonia's noble rank while privately wishing someone, anyone, with actual naval expertise was making decisions. The Duke knew they thought this. Everyone knew, everyone else knew. Spanish honour required pretending otherwise. Philip's plan depended on two men who'd never met coordinating a military operation across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Medina Sidonia commanded the Armada. The Duke of Parma commanded 30,000 veteran soldiers in Flanders. They were supposed to communicate through courier ships, coordinate timing, and execute a rendezvous that would combine sea and land power into an unstoppable invasion force. Neither duke spoke the other's language fluently. Their messengers took days to travel between them. Weather, English patrols, and simple bad luck could delay messages for weeks. Military coordination required constant communication. This operation offered occasional updates and desperate hope. Parma's army was the finest fighting force in Europe, blooded through years of brutal warfare against Dutch rebels. Spanish tercios formed pike squares that crushed cavalry charges and held defensive positions against overwhelming odds. Artillery crews could reduce fortified positions to rubble with mathematical precision. These weren't garrison troops or ceremonial guards. They were professionals who'd perfected the art of killing through constant practice. England's militia would face them with farming equipment and medieval weapons. The disparity was grotesque. But first, somehow, Parma's army needed to cross to England. The invasion barges waited in Flemish ports, flat-bottomed boats designed for river crossings and short coastal hops. They held 20 to 30 soldiers each, offered no protection from English cannon fire, and would sink if exposed to anything beyond modest waves. Dutch rebel ships called sea beggars, shallow draft vessels perfect for coastal waters, blockaded the ports. Parma couldn't move his barges past them. The Spanish Armada couldn't enter shallow water where the barges hid. Someone needed to control the narrow zone between deep and shallow water, where neither force could operate effectively. Nobody had solved this problem because nobody wanted to admit it existed. Francis Drake understood that attacking the Armada directly meant mutual destruction. Spanish galleons mounted cannons on multiple decks. Some carried 50 guns, a few held 70 or more. Getting close enough to board meant sailing through devastating broadsides that would smash English ships to kindling. Medieval naval tactics favoured the side with bigger ships, more soldiers, and heavier guns. Spain dominated all three categories. Drake had helped pioneer a different approach: stay at distance, use superior manoeuvrability to choose engagement ranges, pound them with long-range guns, and never let them close. It was cowardly by chivalric standards. It might actually work. English race-built galleons carried fewer guns than Spanish ships, but mounted them lower in the hull for better stability. Longer gun barrels offered greater range and accuracy. Narrower hulls made them faster and more responsive to wind shifts. Spanish galleons were essentially floating fortresses. English ships were seaborne artillery platforms. One design philosophy assumed boarding would decide battles. The other assumed you could win without ever touching the enemy. Both sides were about to test their theories with live ammunition and actual corpses. Lord Howard commanded from the Ark Royal, a ship owned by Sir Walter Raleigh and leased to the Crown because England couldn't afford to build enough warships. Howard was politically brilliant, personally courageous, and tactically cautious, exactly the combination needed to manage Drake's aggressive instincts without crushing the creative chaos that made English naval tactics effective. He understood his role: provide noble legitimacy to command decisions while letting experienced captains actually fight the battles. Spanish command was hierarchical and rigid. English command was collaborative and flexible. Both approaches had advantages. Only one would prove suited to the Channel's unpredictable conditions. July 20th, the evening. The first encounter happened off Plymouth. English ships approached from behind and windward, forcing Spanish galleons to turn and fight at a disadvantage. Drake led his squadron toward the Armada's southern wing. Spanish ships turned to face him in ponderous formation changes that took half an hour to execute properly. Drake's ships darted closer, unleashed broadsides at 300 yards, then tacked away before Spanish guns could respond effectively. It was frustrating, inconclusive harassment rather than glorious combat. No ships sank. Casualties were minimal. Everyone reloaded and prepared to do it again tomorrow. Spanish captains wanted to close and board. That's what naval combat meant to them. Get alongside, throw grappling hooks, and let soldiers decide the outcome with swords and pikes. English ships refused to cooperate. They stayed at range, fired, and withdrew before boarding became possible. This violated every expectation about how honourable warfare was supposed to proceed. Spanish officers shouted orders that couldn't be executed because the enemy wouldn't stay still long enough to grapple. It was like trying to punch someone who kept dancing just beyond reach while throwing rocks at your face. The Armada maintained formation and continued northeast through the Channel. Medina Sidonia's orders were clear: don't stop, don't chase, reach Palma. Spanish discipline held despite mounting frustration from captains who wanted to break formation and teach these English pirates proper respect. The crescent formation absorbed English attacks without collapsing. Supply ships stayed protected in the centre. The Armada looked invincible because it refused to be baited into breaking formation for tactical victories that didn't advance Philip's strategic objectives. Then accidents began destroying what English guns couldn't. The San Salvador, a massive galleon carrying payroll for the entire fleet, suffered a powder magazine explosion. Nobody knew why. Maybe poor storage, maybe sparks from battle damage, maybe sabotage. The stern section disintegrated in a fireball that killed 200 men instantly. Survivors jumped into the sea. The burning hulk drifted out of formation, valuable cargo and what remained of the crew left behind. Drake captured it later, finding 50,000 gold ducats in the wreckage. The explosion cost Spain money, men, and morale simultaneously. The Nuestra Señora del Rosario, flagship of one of the Armada's squadrons, collided with another Spanish ship during formation maneuvers that night. Her bowsprit shattered. The foremast collapsed. She became unmanageable, drifting helplessly while the Armada sailed on. Medina Sidonia wanted to stop and assist, but couldn't. Stopping meant clustering the fleet in ways that made them vulnerable to attack. The Rosario was abandoned with over 50,000 more ducats in her hold, and Don Pedro de Valdez, her captain, still aboard. Drake captured her the next morning. 2 ships lost without the English firing a shot. God's will suddenly looked questionable. English ships were running out of ammunition faster than anticipated. Guns fired continuously burned through powder and shot that couldn't be quickly replaced. Supply ships followed the fleet, but transferring ammunition at sea in combat conditions was dangerous and slow. Captains started rationing their fire, choosing shots carefully rather than maintaining constant bombardment. The Armada was taking damage but remained fundamentally intact. English strategy assumed they could hurt Spain enough to force a retreat. That wasn't happening. The Spanish absorbed punishment and kept advancing. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about wars. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. July 23rd. A sharp engagement off Portland Bill as the Armada rounded the dangerous headland. Spanish galleons caught some English ships in disadvantageous positions, where the current and wind worked against them. For several hours, Spanish guns actually hurt their tormentors. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, led a counterattack that pushed English ships back. Spanish soldiers cheered, believing they'd finally inflicted serious damage. They hadn't. English ships withdrew in good order, repaired quickly, and resumed harassing by evening. But Spanish morale improved dramatically. Maybe these English weren't invincible after all. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Spain had more ships, more guns, and more soldiers, but couldn't force England to fight the kind of battle Spain would win. England had faster ships and longer-range guns, but couldn't inflict enough damage to stop the Armada's advance. Both sides were essentially stuck executing strategies that prevented defeat without delivering victory. Wars aren't usually won by stalemate, but this conflict was developing into exactly that. A rolling battle where neither side could achieve decisive results. Medina Sidonia sent increasingly desperate messages to Parma. "Where are the barges? When can you be ready? The Armada is approaching the Netherlands as planned. English harassment is manageable but constant. We need your army now." Couriers carried these messages across hostile territory, delivered them to Parma's headquarters, and brought back replies that said essentially, "Dutch rebels blockade the ports, shallow draft Spanish ships can't force them out, we're building more barges but transport capacity is limited. No firm date can be promised." The entire invasion plan was collapsing into a coordination disaster. English coastal towns watched the running battle pass by like a terrifying parade. The Armada stretched for miles, massive galleons with hulls painted in bright colours, banners streaming from masts, the organised power of Catholic Europe sailing past Protestant villages that expected to be burning within weeks. Families evacuated inland. Valuable goods were hidden. Churches held constant prayer services. Militia captains drilled their men harder, knowing it was pointless, but needing something to do besides wait for slaughter. Elizabeth travelled to Tilbury, where English forces were assembling to defend the Thames approach to London. She wore a steel corselet over a white dress, rode through the camp on horseback, and delivered a speech that became legendary. The body of a weak and feeble woman, she told them, but the heart and stomach of a king. She'd fight alongside them if invasion came. It was magnificent theatre, a queen in armour inspiring troops before battle. It was also desperate propaganda because everyone knew if Spanish veterans actually landed, England's amateur militia would be massacred despite their queen's courage. Drake proposed something insane during a council of captains on July 26th. The Armada would soon anchor somewhere near Calais waiting for Parma. Anchored ships couldn't manoeuvre. Fireships, old vessels stuffed with gunpowder and tar set ablaze and sailed into enemy formations, could scatter them in panic. It was an ancient tactic that everyone understood in theory. Actually executing it required sacrificing valuable ships that England couldn't afford to lose. But anchored in tight formation, the Spanish would be vulnerable in ways they hadn't been while moving. Desperation makes extreme tactics seem reasonable. July 27th. The Armada anchored off Calais in a tight defensive crescent. Medina Sidonia sent urgent messages to Parma. "We're here. Bring the army. We can't wait indefinitely in this exposed position." The English fleet anchored nearby, close enough to monitor but not engage. Two fleets sat watching each other across a few miles of water. Parma's response arrived by evening. "The barges aren't ready. Dutch ships still blockade the shallows. I need at least 6 days to embark the army and gather enough escorts. 6 days. The Armada couldn't sit at anchor for 6 days within range of English guns and potential fireships, but they couldn't leave without Parma. The entire invasion force was trapped by logistics that nobody had properly planned. Spanish captains posted double watches that night. They knew about fireships. Every competent navy knew about fireships. Lookouts scanned the darkness for approaching flames. The entire fleet maintained readiness to cut anchor cables and scatter if fire attack came, which meant the English strategy was already working before they'd done anything. The Spanish were exhausted, nervous, and positioned where any panic would shatter their formation. Everything Philip had planned was about to break on a few burning hulks, and the wind direction nobody could control. The channel narrowed as the fleets pushed northeast, transforming open water into a funnel where retreat became increasingly difficult for both sides. Spanish ships maintained their crescent while English vessels shadowed them like wolves following a wounded bear. Too cautious to close for the kill, too persistent to abandon the hunt. Each day brought running fights that accomplished almost nothing except consuming ammunition and testing nerves. This wasn't the apocalyptic clash anyone had imagined. It was grinding, exhausting, and profoundly unsatisfying for captains trained to think decisive battles should actually decide something. English gun crews developed rhythms that Spanish sailors found unnerving. Load, run out, fire, reload. The cycle repeated faster than Spanish ships could manage because English crews had drilled relentlessly, while Spanish sailors were still learning their vessels during the voyage north. Rate of fire mattered when you couldn't get close enough to board. A ship firing 12 rounds per hour inflicted more cumulative damage than one managing 8, even if individual shots were less accurate. Spanish hulls accumulated holes that shipwrights patched frantically between engagements. Nothing catastrophic yet, but death by 1,000 splinters was still death. The Isle of Wight passed to starboard on July 24th. Medina Sidonia considered seizing it as a forward base where the Armada could resupply and wait for Parma in relative safety. Spanish captains scouted the harbours and found them well defended with shore batteries that would exact brutal costs for any landing attempt. Besides, stopping meant abandoning the formation that had protected them through 8 days of running combat. The Duke decided to continue toward Calais. That decision eliminated Spain's last chance to control English territory before the final confrontation. Spanish soldiers crammed below decks were going mad from inaction. They'd trained for boarding actions and land combat, not sitting in dark, cramped spaces listening to English cannonballs smash through oak planking above their heads. Seasickness was constant. Rations were already degrading. Meat turning grey, water developing the slimy texture that preceded wholesale contamination. The smell below decks in any wooden ship was horrible under normal circumstances. Combat conditions with wounded men, terrified soldiers and rotting supplies made it nearly unbearable. Some soldiers preferred risking English guns on deck to enduring the hell below. English captains held nightly councils that devolved into shouting matches about tactics and resource allocation. Drake wanted aggressive attacks that forced the Spanish to break formation. Howard advocated continued harassment that conserved ammunition while preventing Spanish ships from consolidating. Martin Frobisher, commanding the Triumph, accused Drake of capturing Spanish prizes for personal profit rather than national defence, a charge that was probably accurate but didn't help fleet cohesion. Everyone agreed they were running dangerously low on powder and shot. Nobody agreed on what to do about it. The supply situation was becoming critical on both sides. English ammunition ships followed the fleet but couldn't keep pace with consumption rates. Spanish water was turning poisonous in barrels that had been poorly maintained before departure. Food stores that should have lasted months were already inedible. Medina Sidonia's supply officers calculated they had perhaps 3 weeks of rations remaining if they implemented strict rationing immediately. 3 weeks wasn't enough time to invade England, defeat its armies, capture London, and secure the country. The invasion timetable was already impossible before the first shot was fired. Spanish formation discipline started fraying on July 25th during fighting off the Isle of Wight. Several galleons broke ranks to chase English ships that ventured too close. Medina Sidonia fired signal guns frantically, ordering them back into position. Most complied, but the temporary disorder exposed supply ships to English guns. The Armada's cohesion depended on every captain following formation protocols exactly. Individual initiative was dangerous when success required collective action. Spanish captains were trained for independent command and aggressive tactics. Forcing them to maintain defensive formations while being harassed by an enemy they couldn't catch was psychologically exhausting. English ships were taking damage too, just less visibly. Rigging was shot away and replaced constantly. Hulls leaked from near misses that sprung planking without creating obvious holes. Crews were exhausted from days of continuous combat with minimal sleep. Captains rotated through Portsmouth and Dover for emergency resupply, weakening the shadowing force whenever ships departed for repairs. The English fleet's effective strength varied hour by hour as vessels left for ammunition or returned from resupply runs. Coordination was chaotic. Somehow it kept working. The wind patterns in the Channel favoured ships approaching from the west, giving English vessels a persistent advantage in choosing engagement ranges. Spanish galleons had to sail against prevailing winds to close with their tormentors. This meant slower speeds, less manoeuvrability, and constant frustration for captains whose tactical doctrine required getting close enough to board. The English didn't just have better ships, they had geography itself working for them. Philip's planning had somehow ignored that invading through the Channel meant fighting wind and current along with enemy guns. Medina Sidonia's correspondence with Philip became increasingly desperate. Messages sent via fast pinnaces described the running battle honestly. Minimal losses but no victories, English ships impossible to catch, ammunition expenditure alarming, coordination with Parma uncertain. Philip's responses, delayed by the week it took messages to reach Madrid, offered encouragement and prayers, but no practical solutions. The Spanish command structure assumed field commanders would adapt to circumstances using their expertise and initiative. Unfortunately, the field commander had explicitly stated he had no expertise and desperately wanted someone else making decisions. Parma's situation was even worse than Medina Sidonia understood. The 30,000 soldiers waiting in Flanders were ready, but transport capacity was grossly inadequate. Building enough barges to move an entire army across the Channel took months, not weeks. The Sea Beggars, Dutch rebel ships captained by men who'd rather die than let Spanish troops escape their blockade, patrolled constantly. Parma needed the Armada to somehow sweep these blockaders away without entering water too shallow for Spanish galleons. It was an impossible tactical problem masquerading as a coordination issue. Spanish morale oscillated between confidence and dread. The Armada had survived a week of English attacks with relatively minor losses. That suggested English guns weren't as devastating as feared, but they also hadn't accomplished anything except sail through increasingly hostile waters while burning supplies they couldn't replace. Soldiers and sailors knew the invasion plan required rendezvous with Parma. They didn't know Parma couldn't actually deliver what the plan required. Spanish officers maintained positive rhetoric about inevitable victory, while privately calculating how many men would die when the coordination disaster became obvious. July 27th morning. French coast visible to starboard, English coast to port, the Channel narrowing toward Dover Strait. Medina Sidonia ordered the fleet to anchor off Calais and Gravelines. the closest French ports to Parma's position in Flanders. It wasn't ideal. The anchorage was exposed. French authorities were neutral but nervous, and stopping transformed the mobile fortress into a stationary target. But waiting while underway was impossible, and Parma needed time to gather his barges. Spanish ships dropped anchor in tight formation, maintaining the defensive crescent even while stationary. English fleet anchored nearby, close enough to observe every Spanish movement but beyond effective gun range. The two fleets sat watching each other across perhaps 2 miles of grey channel water. Sailors on both sides stared at enemy vessels that had been shadowy shapes glimpsed through gun smoke and now were clearly visible in afternoon sunlight. Spanish hulls showed extensive damage, patched holes, shattered railings, jury-rigged masts where English guns had scored hits. English ships looked battered too, just less dramatically so because they'd been hit less often. Calais authorities sent nervous delegations to both fleets, asking them to please not fight near the neutral French port. Medina Sidonia politely explained the Armada would depart as soon as the Duke of Parma arrived with his army. Calais officials calculated how many cannonballs would inevitably miss their targets and smash into French buildings if a major battle erupted offshore. They sent messages to Paris requesting guidance that wouldn't arrive before whatever was going to happen happened. Neutrality is easy in theory, but considerably harder when 2 hostile fleets anchor outside your harbour, with enough firepower to level your city by accident. Spanish lookouts posted double watches after sunset. Captains' new English tactical repertoire included fireships, old hulks, stuffed with combustibles, set ablaze, and sailed into anchored enemy formations. Every navy used them occasionally. Defence required vigilant watch, boats ready to tow fire vessels away from the fleet, and anchors that could be cut quickly if panic required emergency scattering. Spanish sailors had been at sea for weeks, fighting almost daily, and were exhausted. Maintaining vigilant watch required alertness that exhausted men struggled to sustain. English captains held another council that evening aboard Lord Howard's flagship. Drake proposed the fireship attack everyone had been discussing since Plymouth. They'd need old vessels nobody wanted back, expendable hulks that could be sacrificed for tactical advantage. Dover had several merchantmen that owners had already written off as too damaged for profitable cargo runs. Converting them to fireships meant removing valuable equipment, loading them with tar, gunpowder, old rope, and anything flammable. Then finding volunteers willing to sail blazing vessels toward the enemy fleet before jumping into boats at the last possible moment. It was dangerous work that frequently killed the volunteers. The decision was unanimous. Without Parma's army, the Armada was just an increasingly desperate fleet trapped in hostile waters with dwindling supplies. If fireships scattered them, Medina Sidonia would have to choose between reorganizing his formation, which took hours and exposed individual ships to attack, or retreating towards Spain in disorder. Either option abandoned the invasion plan. Howard authorized 8 ships to be converted immediately. Work began after midnight. Sailors stripped sails, loaded combustibles, rigged the steering so skeleton crews could aim them before abandoning ship. Everything had to be ready by tomorrow night when tide and wind would favor an attack. Spanish sailors tried sleeping while remaining alert for danger. It was impossible. Every sound became potentially threatening. Waves against hulls, wind in rigging, distant calls from watch posts. The entire fleet was one enormous target sitting motionless in an exposed anchorage while the enemy fleet watched from nearby. If someone asked Spanish captains to design their worst tactical nightmare, this scenario would qualify. Yet abandoning the anchorage meant abandoning the invasion. Everything depended on Parma arriving quickly with his army and transport barges. Parma's latest message said 6 days minimum. The Armada didn't have 6 days. Medina Sidonia stood on the San Martin's deck after midnight, watching lanterns glow on English ships across the dark water. He'd been seasick for over a month, commanded forces he didn't understand using tactics he hadn't studied, and followed a plan that was visibly failing. The appointment letter from Philip remained in his cabin, the document that condemned him to this position through royal authority and divine will. He'd begged to be spared this command. Philip had insisted. Now both men would discover whether God truly guided Spanish cannons or whether faith was insufficient preparation for naval warfare. Dawn on July 28th brought no Palmer, no barges, and no miraculous solutions. The Armada sat anchored in formation while English ships maintained their watch. Sailors on both sides could see each other clearly enough to count gun ports and estimate crew sizes. This intimacy was unusual in naval warfare. Normally fleets glimpsed each other through smoke and distance. The prolonged proximity created strange psychological pressure. Spanish sailors saw English ships that looked smaller and less impressive than expected. English sailors saw Spanish galleons that looked terrifyingly massive up close. Both sides were right. The fireships would reveal which perspective mattered more. Midnight approached on July 28th with unusual darkness. Clouds obscured moon and stars, creating the perfect conditions for an attack the Spanish knew was coming but couldn't prevent. Lookouts on every Spanish ship strained their eyes toward the English fleet's position, searching for the telltale glow that would announce fireships. The waiting was worse than the attack itself would be. Spanish captains had boats ready with grappling hooks to tow burning vessels away from the formation. Anchor cables were prepared for emergency cutting. Everything that could be done defensively had been done. It wouldn't be enough. The English had spent the day converting 8 merchant vessels into floating bombs. Crews removed anything valuable, then packed holds with tar barrels, old rope soaked in pitch, dried wood, gunpowder kegs, and anything else that would burn hot and fast. Double-shotted guns were loaded and left. When flames reached them, cannons would discharge randomly, adding explosive terror to the fire itself. These weren't simple fireships meant to burn enemy vessels. They were psychological weapons designed to trigger panic in a tightly packed fleet that had nowhere to run except into each other. The tide turned toward the Spanish anchorage around midnight. Wind held steady from the southwest, pushing directly toward the clustered Armada. English volunteers boarded the 8 fireships and began their final approach under minimal sail, staying dark as long as possible. Spanish lookouts spotted nothing. The blackness was nearly complete. Waves provided natural sound cover, and the English crews were professionals who understood stealth. At half a mile from the Spanish formation, the volunteers lit their charges, locked the helms to maintain course, and jumped into small boats that had been towing behind. Fire erupted across all 8 vessels almost simultaneously. Flames climbed masts and spread across decks with horrifying speed. The ships transformed from invisible threats to blazing nightmares within seconds. Spanish lookouts screamed warnings. Alarm guns fired. Every ship in the Armada suddenly faced 8 burning vessels sailing directly toward their tightly packed formation, with wind and tide driving them forward at perhaps 3 knots. The mathematics was simple and terrible. Fireships would reach the Armada in less than 10 minutes, and there was nothing resembling enough time to organize effective defense. Spanish boats launched frantically to intercept the fire vessels. Crews rowed toward flames hot enough to feel from 50 yards away, trying to get grappling hooks attached to blazing hulls so they could tow them clear of the fleet. Several Spanish sailors succeeded in capturing fireships and redirecting them away from the formation. It was suicidally brave work that probably saved multiple Spanish galleons. But 8 fireships meant 8 separate threats arriving from slightly different angles, and the Spanish couldn't intercept them all before at least some reached the anchored fleet. Panic spread faster than the flames themselves. Spanish captains watched burning ships approaching and made instant calculations about whether to trust their crews could divert the threats or cut cables and scatter. Most chose survival over formation discipline. Axes struck anchor cables across dozens of ships simultaneously. The carefully maintained crescent that had protected the Armada for 9 days disintegrated in minutes. Ships drifted into each other in the darkness, tangling rigging and smashing oars. Some collisions caused more damage than English guns had inflicted all week. The psychological effect was exactly what Drake had predicted. The Armada scattered in chaos despite the fireship attacks sinking 0 Spanish vessels. Only one fireship actually collided with a Spanish ship, and that vessel managed to push it away before catching fire. 7 others drifted through the formation or ran aground on nearby beaches, burning spectacularly but harming nothing except Spanish nerves. In purely material terms, the fireship attack failed almost completely. In tactical terms, it succeeded beyond English hopes. The Armada's formation was destroyed. Ships were scattered across miles of coastline in the darkness, with no way to regroup quickly. Dawn would reveal Spanish vessels isolated and vulnerable in ways they hadn't been since leaving Spain. Medina Sidonia's San Martin remained at anchor, the Duke refusing to cut his cable despite the chaos around him. He fired signal guns desperately, trying to order scattered vessels to reform on his position. Perhaps a dozen ships heard or heeded the signals. The rest drifted northeast on wind and tide, some deliberately sailing away from what they assumed was catastrophic disaster, others simply unable to control their movement in the darkness. By 3 a.m., the Armada existed only as a scattered collection of individual ships and small clusters. The invasion force that had terrified England for 2 years had been broken by 8 burning hulks, and the terror they inspired. English captains watched the chaos from their anchorage with satisfaction bordering on disbelief. They'd hoped fireships would disrupt Spanish formation. The complete disintegration exceeded expectations. Dawn would bring the opportunity every English captain had been waiting for. Spanish ships isolated and unable to support each other, perfect targets for the gun-armed predators that had been stalking them since Plymouth. Supply ships were rushing ammunition forward from Dover through the night. By sunrise, English guns would have fresh powder, and the Spanish would have nowhere to hide. Spanish captains spent the darkness trying to restore order from chaos. Some ships attempted sailing back to Calais to reform, others drifted northeast toward the Flemish coast. A few remained near the San Martin, providing Medina Sidonia with a tiny squadron rather than the massive fleet he'd commanded yesterday. The Duke sent pinnaces searching for scattered vessels with orders to reform at dawn regardless of position. Most never found their targets. As grey light began revealing the disaster's full scope, Spanish officers realised the invasion was effectively over. Without formation integrity, they were just individual ships facing a numerically superior enemy in hostile waters. The flagship San Martin had drifted several miles northeast during the night despite remaining anchored. The current and wind were that strong. Medina Sidonia found himself off Gravelines with perhaps 60 ships in visual range and another 40 scattered somewhere beyond sight. The crescent formation that had seemed invincible was gone. Reformed Spanish vessels clustered in rough groups, but the precise defensive arrangement that had protected them through the channel was impossible to recreate quickly. English sails appeared on the horizon as dawn brightened, approaching fast with favourable wind behind them. Drake's squadron closed first, around 7 a.m., targeting Spanish vessels still trying to reform near Gravelines. Other English squadrons followed, sensing this was the decisive moment where Spanish cohesion could be shattered permanently. For the first time since Plymouth, English ships had opportunities to attack isolated Spanish vessels without fighting through the entire Armada's guns. Captains who'd been frustrated by Spain's defensive discipline for 9 days now faced targets that couldn't mutual support effectively. The Battle of Gravelines was about to begin, and it would be nothing like the cautious harassment that preceded it. Spanish gun crews prepared for closer combat than they'd experienced yet. English ships weren't maintaining safe distances this morning. They were closing to point-blank range where Spanish guns could hurt them. This should have been the combat Spanish captains wanted. The close-range brawl where superior Spanish gunnery and boarding parties would dominate. But scattered formation meant isolated ships would face concentrated English attacks without support. The tactical tables had turned completely. Now Spanish vessels were the isolated predators, and English ships were the pack hunters. Howard's squadron engaged the San Martin directly, closing to within 100 yards, nearly point-blank range for naval guns. At that distance, misses were nearly impossible. English broadsides smashed into the Spanish flagship's hull with devastating effect. Oak planking shattered. Cannons broke loose from their mountings as carriages disintegrated. Gun crews died in sprays of wooden splinters that killed as effectively as metal fragments. Medina Sidonia stood on his quarterdeck watching his flagship take punishment that should have sunk her, holding his position because retreating would signal total defeat. The San Martin absorbed over 200 hits during the morning engagement alone. Spanish ships were taking more damage in 2 hours than they'd accumulated in 9 days of channel fighting. The difference was range. At 300 yards, cannonballs lost velocity and often bounced off heavy oak hulls. At 100 yards, they punched through planking and kept going, destroying everything in their path. English gun crews worked in practiced rhythms, firing as fast as they could reload. Spanish crews tried matching the rate but couldn't. The English had been drilling these techniques for years while Spain's sailors were still adjusting to their vessels. Rate of fire created cumulative advantages that no amount of Spanish bravery could overcome. The San Juan de Sicilia, a Portuguese galleon pressed into Spanish service, drew concentrated fire from 3 English ships simultaneously. Her hull was hammered from multiple angles. The mainmast took a direct hit and collapsed across the deck, crushing sailors and tangling in rigging. Water poured through holes below the waterline faster than pumps could expel it. The ship began settling, stern first, into the channel. Soldiers trapped below deck screamed as water rose around them. Some climbed to the main deck and jumped overboard despite knowing the cold water would kill them within minutes. The ship sank slowly, taking perhaps 300 men down with her. It was the first Spanish galleon lost to English guns in the entire campaign. More Spanish ships reached critical damage levels as the morning progressed. The Maria Juan took so many hits her captain couldn't determine which holes to plug first. She listed heavily to port, deck awash, obviously doomed. Nearby Spanish vessels couldn't assist because they were fighting for their own survival. English ships circled like sharks, selecting targets methodically. The Maria Juan capsized around 10 a.m., rolling completely over before sinking. Survivors clung to floating debris. English ships ignored them. Rescuing drowning Spaniards meant stopping, and stopping meant becoming targets themselves. Spanish captains realized they were experiencing something unprecedented. Their fleet was actually being defeated in combat. Not driven off by superior tactics or forced to retreat by supply problems, actually beaten by enemy guns. Spanish naval invincibility was a myth built on decades of victories against Ottomans, pirates, and colonial rebels. The myth was dying off gravelines, one shattered hull at a time. Officers who'd spent careers assuming Spanish ships were superior to anything they'd face discovered that English race-built galleons with longer guns and better-trained crews could destroy them in sustained combat. English ammunition was running low again despite the overnight resupply. Captains had been firing continuously for hours, expending powder faster than supply ships could deliver it. Some English vessels withdrew from action to reload from ammunition ships anchored nearby. This created temporary respites where Spanish ships could attempt repairs and reforming. Neither side could maintain the intensity indefinitely, but Spanish ships were taking structural damage that couldn't be repaired at sea, while English vessels needed only powder and shot to return to battle. The exchange rate favoured England catastrophically. The wind started shifting northeast around noon, pushing Spanish ships toward the Flemish shoals. Medina Sidonia recognised the danger immediately. If the Armada was driven into shallow water, every ship would run aground and be destroyed at leisure by English guns. He ordered what remained of his fleet to sail north, away from shore, accepting that this meant abandoning any pretense of rendezvous with Parma. The invasion was finished. Survival became the new objective. Spanish ships struggled to make headway against wind and current that seemed determined to drive them onto the shoals. Several Spanish galleons grounded on sandbars as the fleet attempted its desperate northern manoeuvre. The San Mateo and San Felipe, both heavily damaged from morning combat, lost steerage and drifted onto shallows despite frantic efforts to prevent it. Their crews abandoned ship before English guns or Dutch rebels could capture them. The galleons sat stuck in sand and surf, expensive prizes that nobody could claim because approaching them meant also running aground. They'd be salvaged later for whatever remained valuable, but as fighting vessels they were finished. The water depth decreased alarmingly as Spanish ships continued northeast. Captains read their soundings with mounting horror. 30 feet, 25, 20, 18. At 15 feet, the largest galleons would strike bottom and stick. The entire Armada was perhaps 1 more mile from complete destruction, not by English guns, but by simply running out of water. Spanish chaplains led prayers on every ship. Soldiers who'd never prayed before found religion. Medina Sidonia stared at the approaching sandbanks and accepted that he'd been appointed to command Spain's greatest military disaster. Then the wind changed, shifted from northeast to northwest, giving Spanish ships room to manoeuvre away from shore. The change was modest, perhaps 20 degrees, but enough to let damaged galleons claw their way back into deeper water. Spanish sailors credited divine intervention. English captains cursed random weather. Within an hour, the Spanish fleet was moving north into the North Sea, battered and bleeding but no longer at immediate risk of total destruction. They'd escaped, but escape meant abandoning the invasion and sailing into waters that would kill more Spaniards than English guns had managed. English pursuit continued into the afternoon, but half-heartedly. Ammunition was genuinely exhausted now. Many ships had literally nothing left to fire. Howard's flagship was down to her last 3 rounds. Drake had perhaps a dozen cannonballs remaining. Continued pursuit would mean watching Spanish ships escape because English guns couldn't shoot at them. The decision to break off was tactical necessity disguised as strategic choice. English vessels turned back toward the Channel, leaving the Spanish to flee north around Scotland. Medina Sidonia gathered his surviving captains for assessment. Every ship had damage ranging from serious to catastrophic. Casualties exceeded 3,000 dead and wounded from the day's fighting alone. Rations were critically low. Water supplies were nearly exhausted. Gunpowder reserves meant perhaps 1 more engagement before they'd be defenceless. The only route home was north around Scotland, then south along Ireland's western coast. 2,000 miles through some of the Atlantic's most dangerous waters in late summer, when storms were common. The fleet that had terrified Europe was now just trying to survive long enough to reach Spanish ports. English casualties from gravelines were surprisingly light, perhaps 60 dead, maybe 200 wounded. The tactical doctrine of fighting at range had worked better than anyone dared hope. English ships had damage, certainly, but nothing that couldn't be repaired in Dover or Portsmouth within days. Howard sent messages to Elizabeth describing a great victory. He wasn't exaggerating. The invasion had been stopped, the Armada scattered, and England remained independent. But the war wasn't over. The Spanish fleet still existed as a coherent force. It was just heading in the wrong direction for invading England. Night fell on August 9th with two fleets sailing away from each other. Spanish ships limped north, English vessels returned to Channel ports. The decisive battle everyone expected had happened, but results were ambiguous. Spain hadn't been annihilated, but certainly hadn't conquered England. English ships had proven superior in Channel combat, but hadn't destroyed the Armada completely. The real killer was about to reveal itself. Not English guns or Spanish incompetence, but the North Atlantic in storm season with damaged ships, starving crews, and a 2,000-mile gauntlet that would destroy more Spanish vessels than combat ever touched. Dawn on July 29th revealed catastrophe in nautical terms. Spanish ships scattered across 10 miles of coastline, some clustered in ragged groups, others drifting alone toward the Flemish shallows. The crescent formation that had protected them through 9 days of harassment was gone, replaced by chaos that made every vessel vulnerable. Medina Sidonia counted perhaps 5 ships within immediate supporting distance of his flagship. The rest were scattered like leaves after a storm, trying desperately to reform while wind and current pushed them toward shallow water, where they'd ground and die. English squadrons approached from the west with the dawn behind them, silhouettes against the rising sun that made counting impossible for Spanish lookouts straining to assess the threat. Drake's squadron came first, followed by Howard's, then Hawkins leading a third group. The English had spent the night taking on ammunition from supply ships rushed forward from Dover. Powder kegs and shot were loaded in darkness by exhausted crews, who understood this morning would deliver the decisive blow everyone had been expecting since Plymouth. Spanish ships were isolated, damaged, and unable to maintain the defensive discipline that had frustrated English attacks for over a week. The English closed to ranges they'd avoided throughout the Channel battles, 100 yards instead of 300. Some captains pushed to within 50 yards, close enough to see Spanish sailors' faces through gun smoke. At that distance, naval combat became mutual slaughter rather than tactical manoeuvring. Cannonballs didn't just penetrate hulls, they exploded through them, sending oak splinters flying like shrapnel that ripped through human bodies with horrific efficiency. Spanish ships had thicker hulls than English vessels, but thickness mattered less when guns fired at near point-blank range. The San Martin took the initial assault because Medina Sidonia refused to retreat. Howard's Ark Royal closed to within 100 yards and unleashed a broadside that smashed through the flagship's starboard side. Gun ports disintegrated. Cannons broke loose from mountings. The deck tilted as structural supports fractured. Medina Sidonia remained on the quarterdeck, holding position because Spanish honour demanded the commander stay visible during battle. His survival was miraculous and somewhat pointless. He was commanding a fleet that was effectively destroyed, fighting a battle that was already lost, maintaining honour in a situation where honour accomplished nothing except extending the suffering. Spanish gun crews tried fighting back but couldn't match English firing rates. English ships had been designed specifically for artillery combat, lower gun decks for stability, longer barrels for range, crews drilled in rapid reloading techniques. Spanish galleons were modified merchant vessels with guns added as an afterthought to basic designs, meant for carrying cargo. The structural differences translated into tactical advantages that compounded with every exchange. English ships fired 3 times for every 2 Spanish volleys. Over hours of sustained combat, that gap meant the difference between survival and destruction. The San Felipe took concentrated fire from 3 English ships simultaneously. Her ornate stern gallery, a beautiful piece of woodwork covered in gilt and religious carvings, disintegrated in a single broadside. The rudder was damaged, leaving her barely steerable. Gun crews on the main deck were decimated by a cannonball that travelled the entire length of the deck, killing or maiming everyone in its path. The captain ordered soldiers up from below to replace dead gunners. Soldiers had no training in naval artillery. They loaded guns incorrectly, fired without properly securing cannons, and were crushed when the weapons recoiled across decks. Desperation made everyone incompetent. Spanish officers realized they were fighting a different kind of battle than they'd trained for. Medieval naval combat emphasized boarding. Get close, grapple enemy ships, and let superior infantry decide the outcome. English ships refused to be grappled. They circled Spanish vessels like predators, firing continuously, withdrawing before Spanish soldiers could organize boarding parties. This wasn't dishonorable cowardice, though Spanish captains wanted to believe it was. This was evolution in naval warfare happening in real time, and Spain was on the obsolete side of that evolution. The Gran Green, a Neapolitan galleon pressed into Armada service, caught fire after an English cannonball ignited gunpowder stores near the magazine. Flames spread with terrifying speed through a ship filled with tar, rope, and timber dried by weeks at sea. Sailors jumped overboard despite knowing the cold water would kill them within minutes. Burning to death seemed worse. The ship exploded around 9 a.m. when flames reached the main magazine. The blast was felt on ships miles away. Debris rained down across the battle area. A severed human arm landed on the deck of an English pinnace, still wearing a sleeve embroidered with Spanish insignia. The Gran Grin's 400 crew members were simply gone, transformed from living men to scattered fragments in seconds. English captains pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Every Spanish ship showing serious damage drew concentrated fire intended to finish what earlier hits had started. The Maria Juan took a dozen cannonballs below the waterline within minutes. Pumps couldn't handle the flooding. She settled lower in the water with each passing minute, decks washing over as the sea claimed her. Sailors and soldiers crowded toward the bow as the stern submerged. When she finally went under, bodies floated away from the sinking hull like seeds from a dandelion. Perhaps 50 men survived to be rescued by Spanish ships. 300 drowned, their armour and equipment dragging them down into cold darkness. Medina Sidonia's flagship was taking damage that should have sunk any vessel. More than 200 cannonball hits were counted later when survivors assessed the wreckage. The mainmast was shot through in 3 places and somehow remained standing. The stern was shattered, exposing interior spaces to direct fire. The rudder was partially destroyed, making steering difficult. Water poured through hull breaches faster than pumps could expel it. Yet the San Martin stayed afloat through a combination of superior construction, desperate damage control, and sheer luck that nobody could explain rationally. The flagship became a symbol of Spanish determination and Spanish futility simultaneously, still fighting while obviously doomed. Spanish captains tried forming mutual support clusters where ships could cover each other. English squadrons broke these clusters apart by concentrating overwhelming firepower on single vessels until they retreated or sank. Naval combat was revealing itself as mathematics disguised as violence. Whoever concentrated more guns on target for longer periods won, regardless of courage or honour. Spanish ships had fought bravely throughout the campaign. Bravery was insufficient against superior tactics, better designed vessels, and more experienced gun crews. The San Mateo, already heavily damaged from earlier fighting, lost her foremast to English fire. Without forward sails, steering became nearly impossible. She drifted helplessly toward the Flemish shoals despite frantic efforts to regain control. Her captain realised they were going to ground and ordered all hands to prepare for abandonment. English ships circled the dying vessel like sharks, firing into her as she drifted. It was brutal, practical warfare. Finish the enemy while you can. The San Mateo struck a sandbar around 11 a.m. Her captain ordered the flag struck and crew to abandon ship before English boarders arrived. Soldiers waded through surf toward beaches where Dutch rebels waited to kill anyone who made it ashore. English ammunition consumption was catastrophic. Ships that had loaded full magazines at dawn were running empty by mid-morning. Supply vessels anchored nearby provided emergency resupply, but the process of transferring powder and shot in combat conditions was dangerous and slow. Some English captains withdrew from the battle entirely when their magazines emptied, leaving the fighting to ships that still had rounds. The tactical advantage was slipping away not because Spanish resistance was effective, but because English guns were literally running out of things to shoot. The windshift came around noon, subtle but potentially catastrophic for Spain. Breeze that had been blowing parallel to the coast turned northeast, pushing Spanish ships directly toward shallow water. Medina Sidonia saw the danger immediately. His entire surviving fleet would ground on Flemish shoals within the hour, unless they could sail against the wind and current. But damaged ships couldn't point upwind effectively. Torn sails, broken masts, and shattered rudders made precise manoeuvring impossible. The Armada was drifting toward total destruction, not through English action, but through simple geography and weather. Spanish pilots took soundings frantically. 30 feet, 28, 25. Every reading showed decreasing depth as the fleet drifted shoreward. At 20 feet, the largest galleons would ground. At 18, even smaller vessels would be trapped. The mathematical certainty of doom was almost worse than combat. You could fight enemy ships, but you couldn't fight sandbars. Spanish chaplains led prayers on every vessel. Soldiers who'd never been religious found themselves begging God for miracles they didn't expect. The water turned muddy brown as the sea bottom approached the surface. English ships followed cautiously, aware that pursuing too aggressively meant sharing the Spanish fate of grounding in shallows. Howard ordered his fleet to maintain distance and let geography finish what guns had started. Spanish vessels were clearly doomed. There was no reason to risk English ships by closing further. It was sound tactical thinking that looked cowardly to sailors watching enemy ships die without finishing them. Naval warfare was often anticlimactic this way, decided by logistics and weather rather than dramatic final confrontations. The San Felipe grounded first, striking sand at 1 p.m. with a shudder that knocked men off their feet. She heeled to port immediately, deck canting at angles that made standing difficult. Soldiers slid across blood-slicked planking toward the low side. The captain ordered everyone into boats before the ship broke apart. Spanish sailors cut loose everything that could float, barrels, planks, hatch covers, creating a debris field that men could cling to if boats proved insufficient. The San Felipe would remain stuck on that sandbar for weeks, gradually breaking apart in storms until nothing recognizable remained. Then, impossibly, the wind changed again, shifted from northeast to northwest, giving Spanish ships sea room to maneuver. The change was perhaps 20 degrees, but it was enough. Vessels that had been drifting helplessly toward doom could suddenly point away from shore. Damaged ships clawed their way back into deeper water through desperate sail work and navigation that bordered on reckless. Medina Sidonia seized the opportunity immediately, ordering all ships to sail north into the North Sea. It meant abandoning any pretense of rendezvous with Parma. The invasion was finished. Survival became the only remaining objective. Spanish ships struggled northward throughout the afternoon, taking occasional long-range fire from English vessels that were themselves running out of ammunition. The pursuit became half-hearted as reality set in. English magazines were empty, Spanish ships were escaping into open water, and continuing north meant entering regions where resupply would be impossible. Howard called off the chase around 4 p.m. His captains were frustrated. The Armada had been beaten but not destroyed. Spanish ships were sailing away damaged but intact, and there was nothing England could do to stop them without ammunition. Drake's flagship was down to 3 cannonballs. Howard's Ark Royal had perhaps a dozen rounds remaining. Other English ships had literally nothing left. Empty magazines, dry powder rooms, shot lockers that echoed when opened. Continuing pursuit meant watching Spanish ships escape because English guns couldn't fire at them. The decision to break off was presented as strategic. Let the Spanish flee into hostile waters where storms would finish them. But it was actually admission of logistical failure. England had won the battle and lost the pursuit. Spanish casualties from Gravelines exceeded 3,000 dead and wounded. Every surviving ship had damage ranging from serious to critical. Masts were shattered, rigging was destroyed, hulls leaked through dozens of breaches that carpenters couldn't properly repair at sea. Food supplies were critically low, water was contaminated and running out. Medical supplies were exhausted. Surgeons were amputating shattered limbs without opium because there was none left. The fleet that had been Spain's pride was now a floating catastrophe, limping toward uncertain survival. Medina Sidonia gathered surviving captains for assessment that evening. Approximately 100 ships remained under his command. 30 had been lost, scattered, or captured during the campaign. Sailing back through the Channel was impossible. English ships controlled those waters, and another battle would finish what Gravelines started. The only route home was north around Scotland, west along Ireland's coast, then south to Spain. 2,000 miles through Atlantic waters in late summer when storms were frequent, with damaged ships, starving crews, and contaminated water supplies. Nobody mentioned the obvious. More Spaniards would die on this voyage than had perished in all the combat combined. English ships returned to Dover and Portsmouth for resupply and repairs. Casualties had been remarkably light, fewer than 100 dead from combat, though disease would kill hundreds more in coming weeks. English captains filed reports claiming decisive victory. They weren't wrong. The invasion had been stopped, Spanish formation had been shattered, and England remained independent. But the Armada still existed as a coherent force. It was just sailing in the wrong direction, toward waters that would prove more lethal than any English guns. Elizabeth received news of Gravelines with relief and caution. The invasion was stopped, but Spain remained powerful. Philip could build another fleet. The war wasn't over. This was just one battle in a conflict that would continue for years. She ordered medals struck commemorating the victory with the inscription, "God blew, and they were scattered." The propaganda was effective even if theologically questionable. England had survived through combination of superior tactics, better ship design, fortunate weather, and Spanish mistakes. Admitting the victory was complicated would have undermined morale. Spanish ships disappeared into the North Sea as August began. English scouts followed at distance, reporting Spanish course and condition but not engaging. The pursuit was over. The killing was just beginning. What happened next wouldn't be combat. It would be slow-motion maritime disaster, each day bringing new horrors as damaged ships struggled through hostile waters with dying crews. The Channel battles had been prologue. The voyage home would be the real catastrophe. The North Sea accepted the fleeing Armada with deceptive calm on August 2nd, giving Spanish sailors false hope that the worst had passed. 100 ships sailed north in loose formation, maintaining visual contact but lacking the disciplined crescent that had protected them through the Channel. Medina Sidonia issued orders that reveal the desperation behind Spanish planning. Throw all horses overboard to conserve water, reduce rations to 8 ounces of biscuit and half a pint of wine daily, and pray for favourable winds. The horses went over first, dozens of beautiful animals that had been brought to carry Spanish officers through conquered English countryside. They thrashed in the cold water, screaming until they drowned or hypothermia silenced them forever. Water supplies were contaminated in barrels that had been improperly sealed before departure from Lisbon. What started as bureaucratic incompetence in Portuguese supply depots was becoming death sentences for thousands of men. Sailors drank water that smelled foul and tasted worse, because thirst was immediate while dysentery took days to kill. The disease spread through crowded lower decks, where men slept in their own filth, because there was nowhere else to go. Spanish ships became floating plague wards where the sounds of men dying blended with the creaking of damaged hulls and the constant splash of bodies being dumped overboard. The food situation was worse than officers admitted publicly. Biscuits were mouldy. Salted meat had turned rancid months ago. Rice was infested with weevils that soldiers picked out and ate anyway because protein was protein. Men chewed on leather belts, boiled their shoes for broth, and fought over rat carcasses found in cargo holds. Scurvy appeared within 2 weeks, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, lethargy that made simple tasks impossible. Soldiers who'd survived Dutch rebellions and Mediterranean campaigns died from malnutrition on ships that had started the voyage overloaded with supplies nobody had properly preserved. August storms hit the scattered fleet north of Scotland, where Atlantic weather systems collide with Arctic cold fronts to create some of the world's most violent seas. Waves reached 40 feet, smashing over forecastles and washing soldiers overboard before they could grab rigging. Ships with battle-damaged hulls leaked catastrophically. Pumps worked constantly, manned by crews so exhausted they collapsed at their stations and had to be carried below to die. One galleon simply disappeared during a storm on August 12th. Visible at dusk, gone by dawn, 400 men erased from existence without even wreckage to mark their passing. The decision to round Scotland and sail down Ireland's west coast was tactically sound but practically suicidal. The route avoided English naval bases but exposed the fleet to Atlantic storms during peak season. Spanish pilots had minimal charts for these waters. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed and direction travelled since the last reliable sighting. But damaged ships sailed at unpredictable speeds, storms pushed vessels off course by dozens of miles, and cloud cover prevented celestial observations for days. Ships were essentially lost, sailing vaguely southwest and hoping to hit Spain eventually. The first wrecks on Irish rocks happened in mid-August as the Armada rounded Ireland's northern coast. The Juliana struck rocks near Stridale Strand during a storm, breaking apart within minutes. Survivors clung to debris and struggled through surf toward beaches where they expected rescue or at least shelter. Instead, they found Irish clans who'd been paid by English authorities to hunt Spanish survivors. Some Irishmen killed Spanish sailors for their clothes. Others stripped bodies of gold and jewellery before leaving corpses for wolves. A few Irish families hid Spanish refugees, risking English punishment to show mercy. Most chose profit over compassion. Don Alonso de Luzon commanded the Juliana and survived the wreck somehow, washing ashore with perhaps 60 of his crew. They staggered inland, weaponless and exhausted, looking for help. Irish villagers fed them, stripped them of valuables, then reported their location to English officials. Soldiers arrived within days. De Luzon and his men were executed on the beach, quick sword strokes for the nobles, hanging for common sailors. Their bodies were left where they fell as warnings. Within a week, local dogs and birds had rendered them unrecognizable. 3 ships wrecked at Stridor Strand within hours of each other on September 21st, the La Villa, the Juliana and the Santa Maria de Vizon. Over 1,000 men died in the surf, pounded against rocks by waves that made swimming impossible even for those who knew how. Bodies washed up along 5 miles of coastline. Irish villagers worked systematically, stripping corpses of anything valuable before English authorities could claim salvage rights. The beach became an open-air morgue where death had no dignity, and Spanish pride meant nothing except occasionally better quality clothing worth stealing. The Girona, a galleass that had survived gravelines with moderate damage, took on survivors from other wrecked vessels and attempted to limp towards Scotland where Spanish officials might arrange rescue. She carried over 1,300 men, triple her normal capacity. The overcrowding made damage control impossible. When she struck rocks off Northern Ireland in late October, she sank within an hour. 9 men survived out of 1,300. 9. The others drowned, trapped below decks or dragged down by armour they couldn't remove before the ship went under. The wreck site became archaeologically famous 4 centuries later, when divers recovered thousands of gold coins and jewellery from noblemen who died wearing their wealth. Spanish captains faced impossible navigation decisions daily. Sailing close to shore risked wrecking on rocks they couldn't see in storms and darkness. Staying far offshore meant wandering aimlessly if winds pushed them off course. Most chose the open ocean, accepting that some ships would simply vanish while others might eventually hit Spain through sheer luck. It was navigation by hope rather than skill, which worked poorly in practice. The San Marcos wrecked on Clare Island in September with 300 men aboard. Survivors organised themselves on the beach, preparing to march inland and surrender to English authorities rather than starve on the coast. Irish clans ambushed them on the 2nd day of marching. The Spanish had few weapons and no energy to resist effectively. Most were killed quickly. A handful escaped into the wilderness, living as fugitives until captured weeks later. The English hanged them publicly in Galway, making sure the executions were slow and visible. Spanish pride was punished as much as Spanish invasion. Disease killed more men than drowning. Typhus spread through crowded lower decks, transmitted by lice that flourished in conditions where men couldn't bathe or change clothes for weeks. The fever started suddenly. Violent chills followed by temperatures so high men became delirious. Death usually came within 5 days. Bodies were dumped overboard immediately to prevent contagion, but quarantine was impossible on crowded ships. The living slept next to the dying because there was nowhere else to sleep. Some men simply gave up, stopped eating and drinking, and waited for death to claim them. The psychological term is despair-induced mortality. The practical result was corpses adding to the daily tally of men who'd never see Spain again. Pilots reported their positions to Medina Sidonia, when ships managed to stay within signalling distance, and the reports revealed catastrophe. The fleet was scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Some ships were off Scotland. Others had already rounded Ireland and were heading south. A few had turned back toward England in desperation, preferring English prisons to dying at sea. Medina Sidonia commanded a fleet that no longer existed as a coherent force. It was just individual ships fighting private battles against the ocean. The San Juan de Portugal, a massive galleon that had survived gravelines with heavy damage, made it farther than most before geography killed her. She rounded Ireland successfully, sailed south along the coast, and actually sighted Spanish waters in mid-September. Then storms pushed her into Blasket Sound, where currents drove her onto rocks. The crew had survived a month of horror, only to die within sight of home. Bodies from the San Juan washed up on Irish beaches for weeks afterward, identifiable by their Spanish uniforms and the pathetic remains of their equipment. Some ships made it home. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, limped into Santander on September 21st with 200 men still alive out of 500 who'd departed. The Duke was carried ashore on a stretcher, too weak to walk. He'd lost perhaps 30 pounds during the voyage. His hair had gone grey. He submitted his resignation to Philip immediately, begging to be relieved of command. Philip accepted it without comment. Medina Sidonia retired to his estates and never commanded anything again. The appointment that killed thousands of men destroyed him too, just more slowly. Ships arrived in Spanish ports throughout September and October, each one a floating monument to disaster. Hulls were so damaged that some sank after reaching harbour, finally succumbing to accumulated structural failure once sailors stopped pumping. Crews staggered off vessels looking like animated corpses, skeletal, diseased, barely human. Spanish authorities set up hospitals that immediately overflowed with dying men. Priests heard confessions continuously. Mass graves were dug outside every port where Armada remnants returned. The Rata Encoronada, flagship of one of the Armada's squadrons, wrecked on Irish rocks after circumnavigating Scotland successfully. Her captain, Don Alonso de Leyva, survived and transferred to another ship, the Girona, which then wrecked with over 1,300 men aboard. De Leyva died in that second wreck, survived combat, survived one shipwreck, survived weeks of hardship, only to drown miles from potential rescue. His body washed ashore with hundreds of others. Someone identified him by his noble clothing and reported the death to English authorities, who recorded it with satisfaction. One more Spanish noble who wouldn't threaten England again. Irish clans played both sides brutally. Some helped Spanish survivors, hiding them from English authorities and arranging secret passage to Scotland, where Spanish sympathisers might provide transport home. Others killed every Spaniard they found, stripping bodies for profit and reporting deaths for English reward money. The Irish had their own reasons to hate English rule, but Spanish suffering didn't automatically create alliances. Practical economics usually trumped sympathy. Dead Spaniards carried valuables that could be taken without consequence. English authorities in Ireland executed captured Spanish survivors with methodical brutality. Orders from London were clear: no prisoners, no mercy, no ransoms. Spain had attempted to conquer England. Survivors would be killed to discourage future invasions. Hundreds of Spanish sailors and soldiers were hanged, beheaded, or simply beaten to death by English soldiers and Irish auxiliaries. The executions were legal by contemporary standards. Invasion forces captured outside formal warfare had no protected status. The cruelty was intentional. England wanted Spanish survivors to die publicly and painfully as warnings. Ships continued disappearing throughout September. The Trinidad Valenciera wrecked off Ireland. The Nuestra Señora de la Rosa sank in Blasket Sound. The Santa Maria de la Rosa went down with all hands. No survivors, just a ship and 400 men erased from existence. Each wreck had its own horror story that nobody survived to tell. Archaeological excavations centuries later revealed the truth: crushed skulls, broken bones, personal effects that showed these were real men with families and hopes, not just statistics in a military disaster. Medina Sidonia's official report to Philip, submitted in October, was brutally honest in ways that Spanish military reports rarely were. The plan had been fundamentally flawed. Coordination with Parma was impossible. English ships were superior. Weather was catastrophic. Supply corruption had doomed them before departure. The Duke took responsibility for tactical failures, but noted that strategic failures began long before he'd accepted command. Philip read the report in silence, then filed it away. Spain would never publicly admit the Armada's defeat resulted from planning failures at the highest levels. Final casualty counts took months to compile and were never entirely accurate. Approximately 63 ships returned to Spain out of 130 that departed. Around 15,000 men died from combat, drowning, disease, starvation, and execution, roughly half the force that sailed from Lisbon. The financial cost was incalculable. Spain's treasury was effectively bankrupted by a campaign that accomplished nothing except demonstrating that Spanish military dominance had limits. Philip received the news with public stoicism and private devastation. He'd gambled an empire's resources on God's support and lost catastrophically. Bodies continued washing up on Irish and Scottish beaches through November. Hundreds of corpses that nobody could identify, stripped of valuables, left to rot where the tide deposited them. Spanish mothers never learned what happened to their sons. Wives waited for husbands who'd been dead for months. The human cost of the Armada extended far beyond casualty lists into Spanish homes that would never receive closure. The invasion of England destroyed families, bankrupted regions, and shattered Spain's sense of invincibility in ways that would echo for generations. Philip II received the final casualty reports in November 1588, while sitting in his monastery office at the Escorial, surrounded by maps that showed an empire stretching across 3 continents. The numbers were devastating: 15,000 dead, 67 ships lost, and an invasion that never came close to landing a single soldier on English soil. He'd spent 2 years planning, invested a fortune equivalent to Spain's annual revenue, and assembled the largest naval force in European history. England had survived with fewer than 100 combat deaths. The mathematical disparity between effort and result was almost incomprehensible. The fundamental problem had been coordination between forces that couldn't communicate reliably. Medina Sidonia commanded ships that couldn't enter shallow water. Parma commanded an army trapped in ports blockaded by Dutch rebels. The plan required these forces to link precisely in hostile territory while under English attack. Nobody had solved the tactical problem of how deep water galleons would connect with shallow water barges across a gap controlled by enemies specifically designed to operate in that intermediate zone. The entire invasion depended on solving an impossible problem that everyone assumed someone else would handle. Spanish tactical doctrine had prepared them for the wrong war. Galleons were designed for boarding actions where superior Spanish infantry would decide outcomes through close combat. English ships refused to be boarded. They stayed at range, fired continuously, and withdrew before Spanish soldiers could deploy. Medieval warfare tactics met early modern naval artillery and lost decisively. Spain had brought swords to a cannon fight and wondered why honour and courage proved insufficient against superior firepower and tactical mobility. The rigid command structure that worked well for Spain's land armies proved catastrophic at sea. Philip issued detailed orders that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. Medina Sidonia was appointed because he was noble and loyal, not because he understood naval warfare. Spanish captains followed orders precisely even when circumstances made those orders suicidal. English command was collaborative chaos, where Drake could ignore orders, and Howard would accommodate him because results mattered more than hierarchy. Flexibility defeated rigidity when conditions changed faster than command structures could respond. Supply corruption that seemed like minor administrative failure in Lisbon became death sentences in the North Atlantic. Portuguese contractors provided substandard barrels that leaked. Food spoiled before the fleet departed. Water became contaminated within weeks. Spanish bureaucracy emphasized paperwork compliance over actual quality control. Nobody verified that provisions were actually preserved properly. They just checked the paperwork claimed they were. Thousands of men died because someone in a Lisbon warehouse prioritized forms over food safety. Weather killed more Spaniards than English guns managed. Atlantic storms in late summer were predictable, but Spanish planning assumed God would provide favourable winds because the cause was righteous. Divine providence proved unreliable for naval logistics. Ships damaged at gravelines couldn't handle storms they might have weathered when intact. Leaking hulls, shattered masts and torn sails transformed manageable Atlantic weather into death sentences for vessels that were already barely seaworthy. The English had prepared for 20 years through ship design innovation that Spanish shipwrights ignored. Race-built galleons sacrificed cargo capacity for speed and gun platform stability. The tactical advantages were obvious in hindsight. Faster ships controlled engagement ranges, stable gun platforms enabled accurate fire, and narrow hulls made them more responsive to wind changes. Spanish shipbuilding remained conservative, modifying proven designs rather than experimenting with radical new approaches. Innovation defeated tradition when both were tested in actual combat. Drake's reputation proved almost as valuable as his tactical skill. Spanish sailors feared him specifically. The pirate who'd raided their colonies, captured their treasure ships, and emerged from every engagement wealthier and more confident. Psychological warfare was unquantifiable but real. Spanish crews expected to lose before battles began because Drake's legend preceded his actual ships. English sailors believed they'd win because Drake said they would. Confidence became self-fulfilling prophecy when combat outcomes were determined by crew performance under pressure. The fireship attack off Calais was tactically trivial but psychologically devastating. Only one fireship actually hit a Spanish vessel, and that ship escaped undamaged. But the attack shattered Spanish formation discipline at the moment when coordination was most critical. 8 burning hulks destroyed the defensive cohesion that had protected the Armada for 9 days. Spanish captains panicked and scattered because they'd been expecting fireship attacks since Plymouth, and the terror was worse than the reality. Fear accomplished what English guns couldn't. Spanish casualties in actual combat were surprisingly low, perhaps 3,000 dead from English cannon fire throughout the Channel battles. Disease, drowning, starvation, and exposure killed the remaining 12,000 during the voyage home. The Armada was defeated less by English tactics than by Spain's inability to sustain a fleet at sea during extended operations. Logistics killed the invasion more thoroughly than any battle. Food, water, medicine, and navigational capability proved more critical than courage or superior numbers. Philip had assumed religious righteousness would compensate for tactical deficiencies. God was on Spain's side, therefore Spanish forces would prevail despite obvious operational challenges. The assumption was theologically questionable and militarily disastrous. English Protestants made the same assumption about divine favour, but they also built better ships, developed superior tactics, and didn't rely on God to solve their logistics problems. Faith plus competence defeated faith alone when tested by reality. The cost to Spain's treasury was catastrophic beyond the immediate losses. Philip had borrowed extensively to fund the Armada, assuming captured English wealth would repay debts and finance future operations. Instead, he'd bankrupted the Spanish crown for a campaign that accomplished nothing. Spanish credit collapsed. Interest rates on government borrowing soared. The fiscal damage wouldn't be repaired for decades. One failed invasion compromised Spain's ability to finance military operations across its entire empire. England's survival was partly luck, and partly superior adaptation to changing naval technology. The luck was weather, winds that scattered the Armada at Calais, then prevented Spanish ships from returning through the Channel. The adaptation was decades of investment in ship design, gunnery training, and tactical innovation that Spanish conservatism had rejected. When luck and preparation meet, preparation gets credit for the results. England had prepared better than Spain and got lucky at critical moments. Elizabeth's government never properly paid the sailors who'd saved England. Crews were discharged without back wages. Hundreds died of disease in port cities because the Crown wouldn't fund hospitals or food for men it no longer needed. Drake spent his remaining years fighting bureaucracy for compensation he'd been promised. The victory was celebrated with pageants and medals, while the men who'd actually won it died in poverty and neglect. Political glory rarely translates into fair treatment for those who made it possible. Spanish morale never fully recovered from the Armada's destruction. The myth of Spanish invincibility had been fundamental to how Spain controlled its vast empire through intimidation and assumed superiority. That myth died in the North Atlantic along with 15,000 men. Spanish troops would continue fighting effectively in European wars for decades, but the psychological certainty of inevitable victory was gone. Future enemies knew Spain could be beaten if you had the right tactics and sufficient determination. The Armada's defeat didn't end the Anglo-Spanish War. That conflict continued for another 16 years with raids, counter-raids, and smaller naval engagements that accomplished little for either side. But 1588 established that England couldn't be invaded easily, which gave Elizabeth's government breathing room to develop policies that would eventually make England a major power. The defeat wasn't immediately decisive, but opened possibilities that Spanish victory would have closed permanently. Philip never attempted another invasion of England on similar scale. He authorised smaller expeditions that were destroyed before reaching English waters. The failure of 1588 taught him that England was effectively unconquerable by sea, while possessing superior naval technology and favourable geography. Spain would focus its military efforts elsewhere, suppressing Dutch rebellion, fighting France, defending colonial territories. England had fought Spain to a strategic stalemate that allowed both nations to exhaust themselves without decisive conclusion. The strategic balance of European power shifted subtly after 1588. Spain remained the dominant empire with vast resources and experienced armies, but it was no longer the unquestioned superpower that could crush opposition through sheer intimidating presence. England emerged as a serious naval power rather than an offshore nuisance. The balance would shift further over coming decades as English merchant shipping, colonial expansion, and naval innovation continued developing while Spanish power gradually declined from its 1580s peak. Dutch rebels gained credibility and support after watching Spanish invincibility shatter against English resistance. If the mighty Armada could be defeated, then Dutch independence wasn't impossible, just extremely difficult. The psychological impact of Spain's failure cascading through European politics in ways that weren't immediately obvious but compounded over years. Successful resistance encouraged further resistance. Spain would spend decades trying to suppress rebellions that might have been prevented by the intimidation factor a successful English invasion would have provided. The technological lessons were absorbed unevenly across European navies. England doubled down on race-built galleon designs and long-range gunnery tactics. Spain remained relatively conservative, improving existing designs rather than adopting English innovations wholesale. France watched carefully and began developing its own modern navy based on lessons from 1588. Naval warfare was evolving toward artillery duels between purpose-built warships, leaving behind the medieval tradition of merchant vessels modified for combat through adding soldiers and guns. Individual Spanish survivors carried trauma that shaped Spanish culture for generations. Veterans of the Armada didn't talk about their experiences in terms of glory and honour. They described horror, suffering, and senseless death that accomplished nothing. The cultural narrative of Spanish military invincibility was complicated by thousands of men who'd experienced catastrophic defeat personally. Their stories spread through communities, creating counter-narratives that challenged official propaganda about Spanish dominance. The wreck sites around Ireland and Scotland became archaeological treasures 4 centuries later, revealing details about daily life that written records omitted. Divers found personal possessions, rosaries, coins, clothing, weapons, navigational instruments that told stories of individual men who died far from home. The underwater archaeology made the human cost tangible in ways casualty statistics couldn't. Each artifact represented someone who'd had hopes, fears, and families waiting for them in Spain. Philip lived another 10 years after the Armada's destruction, watching his empire's slow decline from the peak it had reached during his reign. He never publicly admitted the invasion was fundamentally flawed in conception and execution. Spanish pride required maintaining the fiction that bad weather and English treachery had defeated a righteous cause. Privately, Philip understood what the casualty reports demonstrated. Spain had attempted something impossible with inadequate preparation and had paid catastrophically for that hubris. England celebrated the Armada's defeat as divine intervention proving Protestant righteousness. The propaganda was effective even though the actual victory resulted from superior tactics, better ship design, and fortunate weather rather than God taking sides in theological disputes. National myths rarely acknowledge complexity when simple narratives serve political purposes better. The story became that brave English sailors defeated tyrannical Spanish invaders through courage and divine favour, which was true enough to be believable and false enough to obscure how close the outcome had been. The long-term consequences transformed European power dynamics in ways neither side anticipated. Spain remained dominant but vulnerable. England emerged confident and expansionist. The Netherlands gained independence eventually. France would rise to challenge Spanish hegemony. The balance of power that had favoured Catholic Spain so heavily in 1580 was fundamentally altered by 1600, not because of single decisive moments, but through accumulated shifts that the Armada's failure accelerated. One failed invasion didn't change everything immediately, but it opened doors to changes that would have been impossible if Spanish troops had actually landed in England. The summer of 1588 revealed that naval supremacy couldn't be assumed from ship counts alone. Tactical innovation, crew training, logistics, weather, and fortune all mattered as much as numbers. Spain had brought overwhelming force and lost anyway. England had been outnumbered and survived. The lessons were studied by every European power with maritime ambitions. The age of Spanish naval dominance was ending not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual recognition that having the most ships mattered less than having the right ships commanded by crews trained in modern tactics. 15,000 dead, 67 ships lost, an invasion that never happened. Those were the immediate costs. The real price was Spain's sense of inevitability, the psychological certainty that Spanish forces would prevail because they always had. That certainty died with the men who drowned off Ireland, and its death changed how Europe thought about power, naval warfare, and the limits of imperial ambition. The Armada's defeat didn't end Spanish power, but it ended the era when Spanish power seemed unlimited and unstoppable. Everything that came after was influenced by that fundamental shift in perception that began when English guns proved effective, Spanish planning proved inadequate, and the Atlantic Ocean proved more deadly than anyone had calculated.